Hi, my name is Crystal Lee. I'm a product manager at Citrix Cloud Native team. I will walk you through the steps to deploy our Cloud Native Stack with Observability Exporter in this video. I will follow the exact step documented in this Getting Started guide on the Citrix GitHub site and show you the expected output and things to watch during the deployment. You can also use this video as a complementary material with the guide. On the left-hand side, I'll keep the guide open to follow the steps here. And on the right-hand side is my terminal window, which I use to deploy. You can find this guide under Cloud Native Getting Started, On-Prem, Service Mesh Lite, COE. Now let's get started. So first of all, you can read on the introduction what you'll be learning with this deployment, but let's dive through directly to the prerequisite. So first of all, you need to bring your own nodes. In my setup, I have the Kubernetes nodes set already. So it's a cluster with 3 nodes, 1 master and 2 nodes. Optionally, you can also set a Kubernetes dashboard, which we will skip. And the third one is that you need to add Kubernetes CIDR routes to tier 1 ADC. So basically, if I do the git nodes -o wide, you'll see those internal IP and make sure those routes have been added to your route table in the ADC. So we'll start with the section 1. So the section 1 is basically the same example that you see in the parent page, deploy the Service Mesh Lite. But we added a few parameters for the COE. So go back to this page. This is the topology. So let me spend some time to explain this topology a little bit. So basically, this is your Kubernetes cluster, and you have deployed a few apps. Let's say team hot drink, team cold drink, team guest book. So first level is we use a CPX, which is a containerized ADC, to control the east-west traffic for a certain apps. And the second level is we have the VPX that's sitting outside of the Kubernetes to do the north-south traffic control with the endpoint as a CPX. And then we will be deploy a COE somewhere as a pod inside of the Kubernetes cluster. And we will collect the time series data and the transactional data from both CPXs and the VPXs. And then we send to the endpoints as promises and elastic. And finally, we will visualize the time series data in Grafana and those transactional logs in Kibana. So that's the main idea for the deployment. So now let's just follow the steps from now on. First of all, create the Kubernetes namespace to manage team beverage workload independently. So let's actually get this YAML first. And let's do a quick more on this file. So we'll be deploying a few namespaces. The tier 2 ADC is for the ADCs, both VPX and the CPX, all sitting in that namespace. Then we have different namespaces for different apps, the hot drink, the cold drink, and the guest book. Okay. So let's do a kube control create namespaces. All created. Number 2, deploy the CPX for hot drink, cold drink, and guest book beverage microservice app. So we'll deploy all these apps. So again, let's copy paste all of them and do a wget. Now let's take a look at each of the file. So first of all, you need to define your role-based access. So these are all kind of standard for the CIC. The only difference, maybe the change that you may need to make is for your namespace. So for my CIC and CPX, I'll be deployed under namespace tier 2 ADC instead of default. So make sure you will get this right. And also for the service account, it's also in this namespace. And the second one is the CPX YAML. So the CPX YAML includes the deployment for all 3 CPX here. So let me go down to the bottom and scroll up and explain to you a little bit more. So basically, in this YAML file, you define the RBAC first, just like what you did for the CIC that's sitting outside. But for the CPX, you deploy the CIC as a sidecar. So you create a service account for your CPX ingress. You define the deployment where you have a pair of containers as CPX ingress as well as the CIC. Now, the CIC image is the latest one. The important part here I want you to pay attention is this config map. So this is for the COE configuration. We pass the CIC config map to the CIC in order to associate with the COE. And the rest of them are pretty standard. And you define the deployment for the ingress for the cold drink, and then the hot drink, and the guest book. So basically you include all the files, all the apps here. So let's deploy them one by one. The role-based access should be global. Everything created. And the CPX, as I said, should be under the tier 2 ADC namespace. Everything getting created. And lastly, you create a secret for a hot drink. Next, deploy the hot drink beverage microservice application in team hot drinks namespace. And let's copy paste all that and do a wget. And also for the hot drink secret. So basically we're doing the same thing for hot drink, cold drink, as well as the guest book. Make sure they're under the right namespace. Okay, then the secret. And the last set is the cold drink. The secret. I download all the files in local, so just in case I need to show you, it might be easier. And we deploy. Okay. Oh, actually I should do a create -f. And last one, I actually create an alias, so I can just say create file name and the namespace. You can also do the same to make your life a little bit easier, not to typing so much. The last one is the team guestbook. Okay. So now let's check the node. Actually, let's check the pods by doing control get pods and in all the namespace. So let's pay attention on these three namespaces. So now we have the front end for code rings, we have front end for guestbook, we have the Redis master and slave deploy because it's a SQL app for the guestbook, and finally we have the team hot drink deploy. Okay, now let's continue on. Let's log into the tier 1 ADC, make sure no configuration is pushed. So this is the GUI for my VPX, and you can see nothing has been successfully configured yet. So we deploy the VPX ingress and Citrix ingress controller to configure the tier 1 ADC VPX automatically. So I already have done wget, and now let's make some change. So first of all, in the CIC YAML file, we need to change the NS IP to the one that I'm using. So my IP address is 217.107 and 5, just to make sure. Yeah. And that's it. And then we save the file and then go to the next file. We need to make sure the front end IP is something that's work for us. So go to the ingress VPX. So instead of this IP address, let's change to my setup's IP address. So I will give it as 9. Another thing to notice is we will need this annotation to be added in order the COE to be working. And also save it. So that's about it. Now create a secret for the login. So make sure we are configured right. Changing the user to your VPX username, which is nsroot, and with the password as well. Enter. Now the secret has created. Next one, let's just create the CIC file and the VPX using kube control. So now everything has been successfully deployed, and you make sure you can add the DNS entry in your local machine so that you can access to those microservices. But before that, let's check what's there on the ADC. So now we can see the LB service has been created and the vServer status is up. So what does it mean is now the VPX has been automatically configured to control the north-south traffic to get into the cluster to the CPX. Now let's move on to check a few things, making sure things are working fine. So first of all, add those entries to your local machine in the host files, which I have already done, and I actually saved in the bookmark. So first of all, let's check if all those applications is running fine. So let's check the hot net beverage. It's working. The cold beverage, it's also working. And lastly, it's the gas break. Okay. And now go to the VPX, and we see the LBB server has been automatically configured, and the states are up. That's why all these apps are working. So now we finish this step, and we can move on to the section B to deploy the COE to visualize the matrix transactional information. So again, let's do a double look at a few files. This is just to create the secret for the monitoring. And let's deploy COE in Kubernetes exposed as a node port. So let's download this file first. Okay, and let's take a look at this file. So in the COE, we define the config map. Remember, the config map needs to be passed to the CIC. So that CIC config the COE. So in this COE file, you will need to config the endpoint. Since we deploy Elasticsearch as one of our endpoints, so the endpoint at Elasticsearch needs to be there, and make sure you enable the desired record type, for example, HTTP, TCP, and so on. And because on the premises it's a scraping mode, so all you need to do is to give the annotation in the COE deployment. So the time series data will be scraped to the premises via this port. And then we define how we want to expose COE as a node port. So here I statically config the node port as 30026 corresponding to 557 for as a TCP protocol. And then also for the 5563, I config the corresponding node port as 30071. So I kind of hard-coded, but in your case, you don't have to. You can dynamically have that node port assigned, and that's also fine. And then let's deploy the COE. Create in the monitoring namespace. And then we deploy a config map to provide endpoint details. So we again look at the file, and let's take a look at this CIC config YAML file. Again, we need to change a few things here. Let's do a pickle. So that should be the endpoint of how you connect to the COE. So here's a trick I use. So now I have one config map for both VPX and CIC. So for the VPX, I expose COE as a node port via the node IP address. So my node IP address, one of them is 10.17.17 and 3. But in the CPX case, you can create another config map and give the name as, let's say, CPX config map. And you can give the FQDN address here. The format be like the namespace dot svc dot default dot something. But in this case, the CPX can also talk to the COE via the node port. So I just have one config map for both CPX and VPX. And now remember the ports that I defined for the promises. So basically for the promises, I'll use this port, the TCP port to scrape. And then for the transactions, I will use the TCP port of 30026. But in your case, you can also just use the FQDN address instead and use that default. I think it's a 557 and 5563 port. So as long as the networking works, it should be fine. So now let's create the config map. And then we deploy the observability tool communicating with COE. We're going to deploy Prometheus, Grafana, as well as the Elastic, Search, and Kibana as pods in our Kubernetes cluster. But in the real world, these things can sit outside of the cluster as well. This is just for the lab demo. So let's create Prometheus, Grafana, Elasticsearch, and Kibana. All these files, you do not need the extra editing. Now move on. The way we expose those tools is through the VPX. So let's double get this ingress VPX monitoring and take a look what's there. So ignore the skipping, it's not the scope of our lab demo. But what you need to do is define the front end IP. So in my case is .9. And then you can see those service has been exposed via ingress to the outside world. We have Elastic, Kibana, Prometheus, Grafana, all set. So the last one is we create the dash F to expose those monitoring tools, and it has been created. So now I think the deployment has done, but let's go back and check a few things. First of all, go to the VPX and refresh the page. So everything is up. So in addition of hot drink, guestbook, cold drink, we can see Grafana, Prometheus, Kibana, as well as Elasticsearch has been exposed. And just ignore the zipkin. We're not using it. So all the service is up. And then we're going to set up our dashboards. So first of all, we go to the Grafana beverage and set up the health dashboard. So go to here. Remember, also have the grafana.beverage.com .8080 defined in your host file. Now the email or username is admin, password is admin. That's the default for the Grafana, and you can skip the step to define the new password. And then what you can do is you can go grab this dashboard and import to your Grafana ADC health dashboard. So let's first add and check the data source. So by default, the moment that you deploy the Prometheus pod, it's already defined. What you can do is just to do the test and making sure the data source is working. And the next step is you can go to import your own JSON file. So I have already downloaded this file locally, and I'll just load it. So it's here, Grafana ADC health dashboard, and you click open. Make sure the data source is the one that we define and import, and boom, everything's shown up here, and we can see the status start showing up. So now we have the session for the ADC health. So you have the CPU usage, you have memory, the network data includes the RX, TX, and what are the CPU cores, the NIC, job packets, GET requests, and so on. And then the application health. So remember, if you see the vServer, and we see there is one zip-key is down because we're not using it, and you can see the same down status for this. The name has been cut, but I think there is a way to look for it. And then we move on to see the kibana. So same thing, you have this defined in your host file. So what we're going to do, open another browser window and go to this address. And we also will going to deploy, import. So what we can do is, let's say, sorry, go back. You can go to saved objects and import with the Kibana app transaction dashboard, which is you can find in here. And the moment you import it, you hit import, done, and you can see the app transaction dashboard showing up. And you will see so far there's no results because we're not sending any traffic. So let's go ahead to do some refresh to the guest book, to the cold drink, and the hot drink. It might take a while. Let's refresh, making sure to see if the hits actually. Yeah, here you go. So now you can see some of the information has been populated. For example, we captured the user agent. I'm using the Macintosh. This is my laptop, including the OS, including more information like Chrome. And I can also see the URL versus the client RTT information, and then the URL versus response code. We'll see what returns what response code, and also we can see the response code distribution. There are a few response generate the 404 value. You now have successfully deployed the COE with your Kubernetes cluster with the dashboard setup. So that's it. And now we can just do the cleanup, the last one. Basically, the moment that you delete all the namespace, everything will be removed. And that's it. Hope that will help, and enjoy your lab. Thank you.